Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Securing Solar Investment Tax Credits ahead of the July 4th deadline webinar. We are honored to have you here today. This webinar is hosted by 10 Power and Red Cloud Renewable, and we are thrilled to have Lawyers for Good Government as a guest, and we are expecting possibly a special appearance by the Alliance for Tribal Clean Energy. My name is Sandra Kwok. I'm the founder and CEO of 10 Power. I will be your host, guiding us through this conversation. And really quick, before we get started, we have a poll for the folks online. Curious how familiar everyone is with the direct pay, also known as elective pay, solar investment tax credit, also known as the ITC option for tribal nations. And Elijah's going to pop that in the chat, and people can indicate what your level of familiarity is with direct pay, the ITC, so we can kind of get an understanding of who's in the room here. Cool, we'll give folks a few more seconds to fill that out, and I'm seeing the majority of people are curious and would like to learn more about exploring a project. And then number two is the idea phase. So that's really helpful for couching the flow of the conversation. Thanks everyone for participating. First off, I'm going to do a very high level overview of the concept. So solar investment tax credits, what they are, how you qualify, and this rapidly closing window and what it all means. Our flow for the presentation will be this introduction, then we'll do a legal overview. Then we'll hand it over to John Redcloud to talk about training and compliance. Back to 10 Power for project development, maybe some words from the Alliance on funding and finance. We'll have some resources from Lawyers for Good Government, who are also doing the legal overview with AC Meyer. And then we'll open it up for questions and answers at the end. But feel free at any point to drop your questions into the Q&A chat so that you don't forget, and we'll address those when we get to the Q&A portion. So 10 Power has been developing renewable energy projects for about a decade. We've been focused on helping tribal nations to achieve energy sovereignty, which we really believe is a core component of true sovereignty through renewable energy. Because for too long, tribal nations have been at the end of the line when it comes to energy access. And this creates a reliance on utilities. Oftentimes, utility rate structures are very unfair. I would go so far as to say racist. And there has been a very unique and incredible opportunity under the Biden-Harris administration with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act for cash to flow back to tribes for projects. And it was the first time in US history where these rebates were made available for tribal nations through the direct pay or elective pay option. And that window is now closing. The Trump administration has ended this. And so we want to make sure that everyone is aware of these credits, and we're here to help qualify as many tribal nations as possible to be able to exercise these tax credits that come back in the form of cash rebates. A little bit of background on energy insecurity or energy injustice. We basically see paying a utility as renting power. So it creates a ongoing liability because the utility corporation can raise prices or can take advantage of communities, and the community funds are flowing one way towards the utility. So it's a bill that's continually paid like rent. So as opposed to having a third party own those assets, we see building renewable energy projects like purchasing your house or your land and making sure that you own it instead of renting it. Dependence or reliance on external grids means that you're placing your trust in that entity, but it also increases risks if there is volatility, if there is vulnerability. Utilities usually raise their rates over time, so it leads to increasing electricity costs, especially with climate change and increased loads that are coming onto the grid, like data centers. There can be reliability risks, so increased risk of blackouts, and especially in vulnerable communities where you have populations that are really reliant on electricity for fundamental heating, air conditioning, for medical devices. It can really be life or death situations that blackouts are throwing folks into. And thirdly, paying a utility every month creates a wealth drain. So as opposed to those dollars staying in the community, it's sending that money off the reservation or outside of the community. Now, on the flip side of that, energy sovereignty really means owning the method of production. So managing those assets. 10 Power as a developer can help set up a long-term operations and management plan and help to train tribal members to manage the assets and to provide the operations ongoing. Using your power where it is generated reduces losses, it increases the efficiency of those assets. Also, owning your assets helps to stabilize your costs. So you have very predictable costs over, we usually model 25 years of the lifespan of a renewable energy project. We've seen projects in the field that have been operating for 40 years or more. And as far as the panels, batteries, we usually give a 25-year horizon. And thirdly, it retains wealth within the community. And so money made or saved from renewable energy installations can be reinvested into other communities supporting initiatives. So typically you would anticipate that a utility would raise their costs. The rule of thumb is by around 2% per year. Whereas if you have a solar project, you know exactly how much your electricity is going to cost. So all of that difference underneath the curve here would be the retained community wealth that you'd be saving with a renewable energy project. Now, into the brass tacks. So that's a little background on the benefits of renewable energy and the path to energy sovereignty. How do we get there and how do we leverage the IRS code? So the alphanumeric call out of this code is 48E, which is the Clean Electricity Investment Tax Credit, or ITC. Prior to the Inflation Reduction Act, the ITC was a tax credit afforded to entities that paid a lot of taxes. So think the ultra wealthy, private equity firms, entities that had really large multi-million-dollar tax burdens could invest some money into renewable energy projects and then not have to pay that amount in taxes, a dollar for dollar tax forgiveness. So with the Inflation Reduction Act, these rules changed. And for the first time, instead of giving just tax credits to wealthy taxpayers, direct pay was established, which enabled tribes or other entities that are non-tax paying to receive those credits as a cash rebate upon the completion of the project. And so this, from our perspective, was a really incredible advent in climate justice because we feel like tribes and non-tax paying entities and like schools and civic institutions really deserve these tax credits and are going to do so much good by implementing solar and renewable energy projects for communities. And so we felt like this was a big move towards climate justice. And we've been working for the last 4 years on getting these types of projects implemented and helping communities to secure these tax credits and bringing these projects to fruition. So what do the tax credits look like? 30% is the base ITC amount, as long as the project meets the labor standards. And then there are all types of additional adders that you can stack on top of the base 30%. So there's 10% for being located in a low income community, There's 10% for being on Indian land, 20% for low income residential building projects, and 20% for qualified economic benefit projects. And some of these cancel each other out. We feel like a safe place to aim for is 30 to 50%. And that is paid as a cash rebate in the tax filing framework after the project has gone live. And I'll go through in the 10 Power presentation how we've put together some creative capital stacks to make all the financing work out. Now, the reason why we are hustling so hard right now is because the ITC will sunset on July 4th of this year. So in order to protect your projects, there's a safe harbor clause for projects 1.5 megawatts or less that are initiated before this date. So under 5 megawatts, you must begin a physical work test on the project, or to safe harbor at 1.5 megawatts or less, you pay 5% of the costs for the project to begin. And just to give you an idea, 1.5 megawatts is it's a pretty hefty. That'd be a couple of 100 houses that could power. So it's a pretty hefty project for most communities. And so with that overview, I will hand it over to AC Meyer from Lawyers for Good Government, who's going to give us a deeper dive into the legal ins and outs.
So hi, good morning. I think Rose is going to put up the slides. One thing I want to do a quick clarification. The ITC does not sunset on July 4th. July 4th is the deadline for getting a project under construction for not being subject to the end of 2027 placement and service requirements. We'll get into some of that nuance there, but I just want to say, projects can be started after July 4th of this year as long as they're placed in service before the end of 2027. But we'll get to that a little bit. Kind of the first thing off of the slides here is this presentation is not legal advice. I am an attorney. I am not your attorney. This is kind of my standard please don't punch our bar card disclaimer. But the information provided here is for information and educational purposes. It is not legal advice regarding any specific implementation of clean energy property. And if you have a particular project or specific property that you want to get advice from, we'll have a slide in here about Lawyers for Good Government's Elective Pay Sprint Hub, which can allow you to sign up to potentially receive direct one-on-one legal advice there with a retention letter. But if you don't have a retention letter, I'm not your lawyer. Lawyers for Good Government is not your lawyer. And we don't have that attorney-client relationship, and nothing I'm saying here today will create that. With all of the wonderful lawyer technicalities out of the way, let's move on a little bit to talk about the credits. Kind of what I'm going to talk about is the investment tax credit overall generally, a little bit on the filing process, what that looks like, how those kind of documents are arranged, and then talk a little bit about the ITC in a post-HR1 world, where we'll talk a little bit about some of those changes that came in last year when HR1, sometimes called the One Big Beautiful Bill, although that name is actually not in the legislation as passed. And also we'll talk about elective pay projects post HR1, kind of the practical effects that has and the real considerations that entities will need to look at. So first of all is the investment tax generally, the investment tax credit generally, and really what we're looking at here is elective pay, which is a special process that allows tax-exempt entities, that is federal income tax exempt entities, which includes federally recognized tribal governments and instrumentalities of those governments, to receive direct payments from the IRS for certain clean energy tax credits. Effectively, what it does is it makes these credits refundable. So even if there is no federal income tax liability, the amount of the credit can be received as a refund instead of simply being held until there is tax liability. So that really makes these credits a viable option for nonprofits. The investment tax credit, which is what we'll primarily be talking about today, is based on the eligible costs of certain eligible property and eligible facilities. And these costs include things that are generally costs that can be capitalized to these projects or to the eligible energy property. So for example, the costs to install it, the costs of construction related to that installation, etc. The most common credit for solar and wind energy facilities is the ITC. At least that's the one we're most commonly seeing at sub-utility scale. So anything, below several hundred megawatts is where these typically fall. The base amount for the credit is 6%, which increases to 30% if the facility has a capacity of no greater than 1 megawatt. So if you're under 1 megawatt, you're automatically in that 30% world. And projects that are over 1 megawatt can get to that 30% world by meeting the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements, as Sandra mentioned earlier. And there's also these amounts increase if certain bonus requirements are met, and these bonuses include several different types. I'll talk a little bit about prevailing wage and apprenticeship on the next slide, which has essentially it's only required for facilities with a nameplate capacity over 1 megawatt. And one thing to remember is that is nameplate capacity. So even if you have a facility that you're not operating over 1 megawatt, if the capacity of the generation for that station is over 1 megawatt, regardless of how it's being operated, it would need to meet the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements to get that 30% rate. So that is a test of, again, nameplate capacity, not the actual output of the facility. So I haven't seen anybody get tripped up there because we're usually quite clear about that, but I always like to be clear about that because I see that as a potential, and it is a question that has been raised at some point. Essentially, the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements apply to workers that perform construction, alteration, or repair on eligible property, and says that these workers must be paid at prevailing rates, uh, sorry, at the prevailing rates applicable to the property's location as listed on the sam.gov website. So those can be looked up there. I think most entities are relatively familiar with those rates from other requirements around that, especially governmental entities. They also require a certain percentage of labor hours to be performed by apprentices from registered apprenticeship programs. The idea there is to train up the talent that's coming up through the field. There are exceptions if no apprentices are available, but it's still important in those cases to document good faith efforts to find apprentices, document that there has been efforts to reach out to those apprenticeship programs, and there's either been no response received or a refusal from the programs. Um, and entities that employ 4 or more people to perform construction, alteration, or repair on the property must employ at least one registered apprentice. And again, the exceptions are available if no apprentices are available within the area. But again, it's important to document that just as a matter of general practice. And then moving on to some of the other uh, potential bonuses. Again, we talked about the PWA. There's the domestic content bonus. This is effectively required for elective pay in 2026 and beyond because there are substantial penalties for failing to meet domestic content that exist only in the elective pay world. They are specific to the elective pay that imposes this requirement. Essentially, it says that certain percentages of project components must be produced within the US. The specific required percentage is going to vary based on the year that the project is being begins construction, as well as vary slightly by technology type. So if you have questions about your specific project, that's one to reach out and engage counsel to double check what those requirements are. Additionally, there's the energy communities bonus, which can add another 10% if the property is located in certain designated census tracts. These are primarily tracts where there has been the closure of a coal mine or the closure of a coal-fired electrical facility within that tract or a neighboring census tract in specified time periods. And again, if you have questions about specific projects, that's possible to look up and we can provide resources there. There's a slide that will have some of that information at the end of our presentation here. And then also the low income communities bonus, which can add anywhere between 10 to 20% depending on the category there. The one thing about the low income communities bonus is it must be applied for before the eligible property is placed in service, and it must be it's a competitive process. So that specific bonus is potentially competitive. Next slide, we can talk a little bit about the typical examples. So we typically see for the ITC is rooftop solar, solar farms, battery energy storage, wind farms, hydropower, some geothermal, some hydrokinetic. And this is really a list in descending order of the frequency that we see these projects. So again, primarily we're looking at rooftop solar, solar farms, battery energy storage. Um, in terms of the ITC characteristics, all projects again have to be new energy property placed in service by the entity that's claiming the credit. They're calculated based on the eligible basis in the eligible energy property. They come back as a lump sum for the year in which the property is placed in service after a tax return has been filed. So it's one of those where it's very much an on the back end credit. And in some cases, the distance between when the property is placed in service and when the credit is actually received in cash through the system can be a year or sometimes more, depending on when the taxable year ends, when the tax filings go out, etc. Um, there is a recapture provision for the ITC if the property is destroyed, sold, or otherwise ceases to be qualified as eligible property at any point during the 5-year period that begins when the property is placed into service. So you can't just put the property into service and immediately turn around and sell it, because if that happens, then there's a requirement that the credit be paid back. So that's also important to keep in mind. Property is also subject to what's called the no excess benefit rule, where if you receive a grant fund specifically for the eligible property, the combination of that grant plus the credit amount cannot exceed the cost of the property. So for example, if you get 100% of the cost of the property paid for by grants, none of the credit is available. If you get 90% of the cost of property paid for by grants, then the credit must be reduced to only 10% of the eligible costs, regardless of whether it could otherwise be 30% or more. So basically what they just don't want to do is have entities getting more money back than they paid out of cash on hand for the eligible property. And next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about the filing process overview. So in general, in the filing process, there's a pre-filing registration. After placing eligible property in service, it has to be registered with the IRS through their website. That's a unique registration number. That registration number has to be used on the tax filing. Those filings are due 4.5 months after the end of the taxable year in which the property is placed in service. And it's possible always to request a 6-month extension on that, which takes you out to 10.5 months if that extension is filed on or before that initial 4.5 month deadline. Once the returns are filed, the IRS makes payment after reviewing the filing. Again, this can be more than a year after a project is placed in service, so it's important to have that bridge financing out there on the timeline. In general, the pre-filing registration must be done, so next slide, must be done after a project is placed in service. The registration number is required to file, and that registration is done through the IRS pre-registration portal. Again, it's important to register the property really as soon as possible once it's in service. If there are multiple projects in a taxable year, it's best to wait until information for all projects for that taxable year is available, because once a pre-registration has been submitted, you have to wait until that's been reviewed in order to submit the next one. So essentially there can't be more than one submittal in flight at any given time. So it's important to make sure that everything is grouped together. And the IRS has a service level there of 120 days between when something is submitted to when the unique IDs are issued. In practice, that's typically faster, but it's best not to assume that it would be any sooner than 120 days, especially when you're looking at deadlines. Next slide. So that taxable year and filing deadline, again, that has to be happen within the initial filing deadline is 4.5 months after the end of the taxable year. So you need to know what your entity is operating on for a taxable year. And that's something that, again, we can help you out with if you have specific questions around that through the Elective Pay Sprint Hub. Some examples of filing years and what deadlines might be are included on this slide, and these will be distributed after the fact as well. So next slide. Filing the returns, again, the credit cannot be claimed on a late return, so it must be filed on an original timely filed return. So knowing those deadlines are very, very important, and making sure that you're hitting that or at least getting an extension request put in place by that initial filing deadline. Um, Non-governmental entities, this non-US governmental entities, must e-file. So that's another thing that has to happen. Paper filing is no longer an available option for non-governmental entities. E-filing providers make sure that the e-filer has done this before and knows what they're doing. So the next slide. So ITC in a post HR1 world, we'll talk a little bit about what those changes are. Essentially, the changes do not fundamentally change the rules. They shift some of the deadlines around, but they don't change what is required to qualify for the credits, and they don't change the general documentation requirements. They also do not change the old credits under sections 45 or 48. For the most part, those are all water under the bridge, but the important thing there is that it retains the credit for ground source heat pumps. What it does do for wind and solar especially is change the credit availability timelines and also impose some new rules regarding dealings with prohibited foreign entities that are particularly important considerations for anything that begins construction after December 31st, 2025. So eligible facilities, additionally, all eligible facilities that begin construction after July 4th, 2026 must be placed in service before the end of 2027. So it significantly shortens that timeline for projects that begin construction after July 4th, 2026. Basically gives you an 18-month timeline from breaking ground to end of construction if you end up beginning after July 4th. Um, if the project begins construction before that date, the old deadlines apply. There's also that repeal of the commercial vehicle credit and the repeal of the credit, impending repeal of the credit for electric vehicle rechargers, which essentially those have to be placed in service on or before June 30th, 2026 to be eligible. Next slide. So for solar and wind, the big thing here is again that begin construction on or before July 4th, 2026 to avoid that accelerated 2027 placement in service deadline. Um, and again, we'll talk a little bit about what it means to begin construction in the next slide. For battery energy storage, that timeline does not change. Battery energy storage is still viable through the end of 2032. So that includes a wide variety of things. So if you're looking at batteries and solar, it's better to kick off the solar first, generally, and then put the batteries in later. Next slide. So the prohibited foreign entity rules as well. These are three categories. Entity level rules are much less of a concern as a practical matter because the entity, those deal with ownership and control of the entity. And it would be extremely unlikely that a tribal entity would be considered to have to be under ownership or control of a covered nation, which is China, Iran, Russia, or North Korea. That's simply not likely to happen. The payment rules deal with payments made under contracts with respect to the qualified facility. So things like exclusive maintenance agreements, exclusive warranty agreements. If essentially an entity that is controlled by a prohibited foreign entity, so China, Iran, Russia, or North Korea, or is organized under the laws of those countries or headquartered in those countries, if that entity as essentially a right to control, which is typically interpreted as something like an exclusive right to repair, where they could withhold their willingness to repair the facility, which would take it out of commission. Those situations can disqualify a facility from the credit. Additionally, material assistance rules looks at sourcing of where the materials are coming from and the ownership of the entities that are producing those materials. Timing, the entity level and repayment rules begin to apply in the first taxable year that begins after July 4th, 2025. material assistance rules are already in play for anything that begins construction after the end of 2025. Violating any one of these rules with respect to a facility will disqualify that facility, and we're still waiting on guidance from the Treasury related to the PFE restrictions. And then next slide, elective pay. What does this mean in practice? Essentially, get the wind and solar facilities under construction as soon as possible. Um, Either by paying or incurring 5% of total costs or beginning physical work of a significant nature. Again, the wind facilities, either wind facilities and solar facilities over 1.5 megawatts must use that physical work test, so begin physical work of a significant nature to determine whether that 2027 placement and service deadline applies. For small solar projects, they can use either that 5% cost or the physical work safe harbor. And then the last slide here, kind of practical effects. Next slide is very important just to remember that the process is still being paid out. The IRS is not refusing these credits, and they are still moving forward with it. Our elective pay sprint hub, we have, I think it's over 100 entities right now, projects that are pushing through that. So we're still seeing community demand for this, and we're still seeing people moving forward. And then this slide just has links to information about that and more detailed pages. And with that, I'll turn the presentation back over to Sandra, and we can go from there.
Thanks, AC. I know that was probably a lot of very technical information for folks who may just be dipping a toe in, and we are absolutely here to help. Thanks for the correction. I misspoke on when I said the ITC is sunsetting July 4th. I meant the ITC is sunsetting in general for solar and wind, and July 4th is what we see as the realistic deadline for safe harboring or beginning physical work on projects. Because in our experience, getting projects finished before the 2027 deadline would be pretty difficult. So our next presenter is John Redcloud from Redcloud Renewable, who's going to be sharing with us about workforce development and with the amazing training opportunities that they're providing out there at Redcloud. Welcome, John.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Really appreciate the opportunity to share today and work closely with 10 Power, a real advocate out there in the clean energy industry. And I was trying to keep up with AC. I got to tell you, that's a lot of material to digest. Helping us understand it, crystallize the material is incredibly useful. Just thanks for being here. Just want to extend my gratitude to you for that. It's really, really helpful for those of us that are not as well versed as you. Really, really appreciate that. I have a presentation just to share, a real brief one, about some of the things that Red Cloud Renewable is doing in the community, and one example of what is possible with a supportive environment and collaboration and partnerships. I'm trying to see if I presenter material here. Let me see here. Share. Yep, sure do. Okay. I believe I do. Okay, I will do this one. Thank you so much. So happy to share. Again, this is our 501c3 is based on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, and this vision for my dad started back in 1997, but it's essentially leaning into the traditional belief system of the Lakota people and many other tribal nations, harnessing the power of the sun. And something that my dad continuously speaks of is this life-giving power of the sun. And in the Lakota language, it's there's a saying that say, you know, it's like Wichoni is kind of the word for life. So this is our way of honoring that sun, and we like to say that we're creating solar warriors out there in Pine Ridge. Those of you may have been to Pine Ridge, South Dakota, southwest corner, the foothills of the Black Hills. So this is my dad's executive director, and I have the privilege to serve as the director of operations for our 501c3 that's been in place since 2016. So we're really excited to share what we do. This is what the Solar Warriors are doing today, on behalf of Indigenous communities and in general, on behalf of this effort to create a workforce that's really homegrown. And in Pine Ridge, unemployment rates are pretty high, and this is not something that's unique to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation or the Oglala Sioux tribe. There are a number of tribes, 575 across the country, who experience very similar social ills such as that. So our model, and again, as an organization for 10 years, we're trying to provide and create a pathway of difference for Indigenous community members to find their voice, get a foothold in the clean energy industry, which we believe is really taking off. So we have our program, our solar training program, PARP. We have a bridge program. This is specifically for Native American women. And we have home energy makeovers through our weatherization program and sustainable building. We use compressed earth blocks. And of course, it's really, really key and critical for us to make sure that tribes are aware of not only what we do, that they also have the capacity to engage in a similar type of work. And leaning into Red Cloud Renewables' origin story and the physical place on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, looking at median household incomes and things like this, the hard realities are our county, Oglala Lakota County, South Dakota, consistently ranks very close to the bottom, if not the bottom, in median household income, maybe $25,000, $30,000 a home. I share that because part of our story of defining what agency looks like is to say, if we can do it in Pine Ridge, you can make this happen in your area, no matter what state you are, across the political divide, the political boundary, whatever state you happen to be operating. We're doing this in a very conservative state, very much so, and yet we're still doing this. So we think if we're able to do it, then it can also be done and replicated elsewhere. So why this solar warrior movement? Of course, we know January 20th, 2025, the clean energy industry underwent a huge, huge momentum shift. So we found ourselves looking in a different direction. Things were looking great. IRA, bipartisan infrastructure law passed. Everything was looking great. And then all of a sudden, fallback, recessions, de-obligations, however you want to call it. The money evaporated, right? So this created an opportunity, and I've been hearing this at some of the clean energy conferences, the symposia, these events, and these seminars where tribes are starting to look around and say, look, we really have a unique opportunity here to assert, understand responsibly what energy sovereignty, tribal sovereignty, providing avenues for our own code writing and looking into that and trying to find out what exactly that means, working very closely with tribal leaders. So with the Red Cloud Renewable Energy Center, we're on the reservation. And my dad and I, we're not politicians. We don't run for office. We're born and raised on a reservation, and we make our living, the legacy of the Red Cloud family, everything's involved in our 501(c)(3), but we don't drive policy. We don't create policy. We're not in the office of the president, the vice president. We're not politicians. We're a grassroots movement through to the core. So again, we lean into workforce development and self-determination and understanding that Pine Ridge Indian Reservation isn't unique, but a microcosm of what happens in other Indigenous communities around the country. And many of us do not have some of these fantastic gaming operations, but there are still people, human beings, communities that are impacted by utility rates and um, these other conditions in the environment, depending on what state you're from. So we believe in order for tribes, it's it's an important aspect of it for tribes to understand, like, we can lead the way, our people will follow us, and again, tribal led, not tribal adjacent. Again, I mentioned this before, founded in 2016, 10 years as a 501(c)(3. I'm one of the original incorporators, Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, and we have today three pillars: workforce development, energy sovereignty, sustainable building. We feel like these are ways that we stand on these three pillars because we've listened to the community. We grew up in the environment. We looked around, we understood. We're trying to project. We're trying to look at the partnership. We're trying to look at the opposition, if you will. We're trying to look at some of the barriers. We're trying to find ways to complement some of the um, I guess, policies that are in place. Also trying to find our own voice, and trying to make sure that we are leading by example and trying to do so with that thought of the seventh generation in mind at all times. So there are a number of tribes that are out there, 575 now. This slide's outdated, but the Lumbee tribe just obtained federal recognition and is in process of getting some land. Um, and we feel like, tribes have this opportunity now to really look at that sovereignty piece. And most tribes do not have coal or oil or any other way to mine or to do anything to develop resources on their land. Maybe a handful do. So energy sovereignty looks very different if a tribe is, let's say, has a great oil deposits or are able to mine coal or any other sort of minerals there, but the rest of us don't. And what I've always said at these conferences, and we all know it here, but the sun shines on all of our reservation lands, and the wind blows. So it's just important to harness that. That's what it looks like. So that way, the handful or so or dozen or so tribes that do have it, then we all have access to renewable energy. So it's just harnessing it and leveraging it. So, and we all know the ways that it helps. Red Cloud Renewable Energy Center, that's a picture there of my dad. We were first of a kind and one of a kind, generally pretty good accolades. And for a while it was, but after a while, as a on an Indian reservation, a renewable energy training center, um, maybe this can be done elsewhere. So we'd like to say our model is replicable across any tribal land, with any sort of grassroots effort, this can be done. And for us, we like to incorporate, the OSHA 10 CPR first aid. These are things that are included in the training that we provide. We provide career services as well, and leverage, lean into different job opportunities, with our partnerships that are out there. And for us, our culture is really, really important. On our campus, we have a sweat lodge, for example. Students are welcome to participate if they want. We have sweet grass, we have smudging, we have a big drum. We have a teepee on campus. We make it very important to us. This is who we are, true to our core. This is something that we have always done, and students who are welcome to come, and it kind of gives them that sense of I feel like I belong. This space is also mine. So it's very important, for us that we're practicing that and making sure that our students get a chance to feel that, as well as they come to our campus. And we have now this year an online version of our classroom. We are licensed to Solar Energy International. So we're licensed curriculum providers. We have an on-demand version for the PV 101. And then of course you can't, learn how to operate a torque wrench or lift a solar module without coming to our campus. This is a picture of some Northern Cheyenne tribal members who came to Pine Ridge and undertook one of our hands-on. It's PV 201L lab week, good tide. And um, we have a roof mount, we have a ground mount, and we have a pole mount lab and some battery stations as well. So it really helps them with understanding the concepts and the tools there. Again, there's fall safety. All these things are kind of part of our training there in Pine Ridge. In our pre-ARP program, just basically how we create solar warriors, everything that goes along with becoming a solar installer, getting those basics, those fundamentals. And then part of one of our hallmarks of our program is we do have a community installation. So students get the classroom learning, they have a lab week, and then through the generosity of some of our supporters, we're able to go out and find a participant in the community, put a real solar system up, roof mount, ground mount, whatever the case is, and the students get to turn wrenches and they get to feel what it's like to go and affect tangible benefit to a community member. So that's a real win for us. We like that model, and we like, each year we try to do this, and it's all contingent upon funding, of course, but built into it is kind of again, we lean into all the certifications that are there. We want to make sure that we're compliant as well, and that students feel like they belong there. And our career services is building every year. Just want to really mention, one of our hallmark programs, Native women don't have the I feel like the amount of representation, they're very underrepresented in the industry. So we designed this program specifically to uplift them by removing some of the barriers we felt stood in place. Mentorship, childcare, travel assistance. These things were key, I think, to creating the successful program. So we have a classroom that's all for Native women, the instructors as much as possible, Native women, and that way they can create that confidence, build rapport together. And if there's something, there's magic that happens there, and we're unable to really quite pinpoint it, but we just know that it works. And the outcomes are women are working in the industry, women are graduating, and women are getting out there. And I think the critical point there for us was recognizing what some of the barriers were and then finding ways to help overcome those. So anyway, we're really proud of this program with the picture of some women who finished their community installation in Pine Ridge. And one of the feedbacks that we're getting is it really helps to have that child care stipend to help offset some of those costs. So we really work hard to make sure that's a key component, key offering. We know how expensive that is around the country. Um, so the students can come and they can relate to each other and like, man, I sure use that stipend to help, help me get here for 2 weeks. So it's a really, really big deal and we feel really helpful. We're great, it's an awesome feeling to be able to help and make sure that happens. Even if it's for, 2 weeks can be a long time away from those who, might be first time mothers, young mothers, or just mothers in general, leaving your family, the nest, you have your babies. We get it. And Red Cloud Renewable, again, we really stand on this native leadership component here. We feel like it's important for this to be modeled. We're not tribal politicians, but we come from the reservation community. We grew it. We grew up there. We lived it. We know it. We understand it. We listen to people. We are one of the people, and we feel like that makes a difference as well in a very welcome kind of environment. So, but none of this could happen without partnerships, and these go across state lines, tribal lines. We have a great number of friends out there in the community who simply, for whatever reason, they have a passion for the American West. They have a passion for renewable energy. This is a perfect crossroads for them, and they see something that's being done at Red Cloud Renewable, and they're able to support our work. Case in point, Mumford and Sons, one of these great, like a world renowned rock star. That's Marcus Mumford. He came down to our campus and he met my dad, and he was, really, he grew up. He has a very British accent. If you haven't met him, but superstar around the world, and he invites Red Cloud Renewable when he's in the area to with a concert. This is at the Red Rocks Amphitheater in Colorado. So we were behind stage. We got a chance to address the crowd, and it's really nice. Again, partnerships are really what makes any of our work possible. And they don't have to be glamorous and world famous, but they can just be a person, a family at home saying, I really believe in what you do. Here's a gift here. Here's a $50 gift. I can do my best around the holidays. Here's $100, wherever the case is. All of it helps. Of course it does. So we have other friends, and anyway, this is one of our good friends there, Marcus. And this is the way that tribes engage with us. There are tribes that do have 477 training programs, and they have other federal funding, and they're able to send their people to us so we can get them trained up, send them back home. They can be on the forefront of tomorrow's energy future as the solar warriors. So this is our home model. We think it works. 10 years, kind of speaks for itself. Um, and this is kind of my last slide here, but what we are doing is really, really key and critical. And now, especially where we got a little less than 3 years now, it's going to be some rough seas here for us that are occupying the clean energy industry. Hats off to everyone that's here, continuing the work that you do. Just wanted to give a small example of what we are doing in Pine Ridge. Grateful for the opportunity to share, to hear, and just to be on the same wavelength as Sandra and 10 Power and her team as well. Thank you very much, Sandra, for the time to share. I really appreciate it. I will pass the baton back to you.
Thank you, John. It's really an honor to be collaborating with you, and we so deeply appreciate all the amazing work that Red Cloud has been doing for decades now. And I see a question in the chat. We can either answer it in the chat or we'll do the Q&A at the end. Thanks for putting that in there, Diana. So yeah, training and compliance, super important, getting Native people trained for those apprenticeship opportunities. And we are also all about making sure that people from the community are getting hired for those long-term operations and maintenance jobs that are created by projects. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about project development. And we know that there's a whole bunch of information that's just been kind of fire hosed out here about the ITC and direct pay. And so what 10 Power is here to do is really help to distill the information that is relevant to your project or your idea and make sure that we are getting the safe harbor requirements in before the July 4th deadline, which means that we have 4 years to complete the projects. We help to raise capital. We help to make sure that there's community engagement going on. So I'll do a little overview of our services, and you can begin at idea stage with us. Your project doesn't have to be completely thought out. We can help you from basically square zero to get these projects off the ground and running. A little bit of background about us. Our mission is 100% renewables for 100% of humanity. We've been operating for 10 years now. We partner with tribal nations to build, own, and operate renewable energy projects. And with every single project, we want to make sure that we're partnered up with amazing folks like John to ensure that local people are trained and that there's a gender equity lens throughout. This is a little bit of drone footage from a project that we will be celebrating a ribbon cutting ceremony in the spring. This is a project that is at a school in White Earth Nation called the Pine Point School. It's a 100% tribal school. The facilities also serve as an elderly gathering center. And we have built a resilience hub there that includes a half megawatt, so 500 kilowatts of solar photovoltaics and 2.76 megawatt hours of battery backup that will serve the Pine Point community of over 300 tribal members. So if the electricity goes out, folks can walk to this warming hub, make sure that they have charging devices, and it will generate more than 100% of the kilowatt hours that the school uses in a year. We were deeply involved with negotiating with the utility to make sure that the rates provide favorable outcomes and returns, and we're really excited that this project is going live. So we set up a very interesting structure here. The project was developed in partnership with Eighth Fire Solar, which is a Native-led community-based organization that is headquartered in the Pine Point community. And we set up a joint venture with Eighth Fire Solar. So that joint venture is the entity that took on debt for the bridge loan. And then we fundraised all of the capital for the project as either grants or forgivable loans to cover the ITC amount, which protected all the parties from any risk. And so the joint venture took on the debt. It was $0 out of pocket for the tribe or for the school, and the school is going to be the long-term owner of the project. So it's really within 10 Power's DNA to set up creative structures that maximize the returns for the community and to work with whatever the appetite of the entities are in terms of wanting to take on debt or do investment or not at all, wanting to find as many grants as possible and setting up other structures to take on any risk or financial liabilities. The way that we set up the project finance to maximize the investment tax credit was out of the total project costs, we qualified for the 30% base plus a 10% adder of ITC. So these are the direct pay tax credits that will be returned as cash with this coming filing year for taxes. We raised the additional amount of the project as grants, and this could also be other types of project financing. There are lots of different options out there. And then we secured a bridge loan for the portion of construction that we needed to cover that we will receive back as the ITC direct pay. So this we actually structured as a recoverable grant. So it's treated as a loan, but if something goes sideways with the ITC and we don't actually secure those credits, then this loan will convert to a grant. So it's very forgivable capital. And once again, 10 Power and 8th Fire Solar raised all of the money for this project, so it's zero out of pocket for the tribe. And we are wholly dedicated to providing maximum returns for communities. So wherever you are in your project journey, if you are at the very beginning of thinking about a project, or if you already have a project that's underway that you want to try and file for ITC credits for, we are here to meet you exactly where you are and work with your team. And so some of the services that we can provide are help with initiating or accelerating or managing projects. We can help with council resolutions. We can help with a lot of the internal conversations, answering questions, making sure that everybody within the decision-making structure is comfortable with moving forward with projects. We do community outreach and engagement with our local partners, so helping to bring in entities for job fairs, hosting community gatherings to answer questions for the community, making sure that everybody feels like they have a stake in the project. And we've had some really delightful community meetings with White Earth Nation members. We negotiate with the utility, which can be a big one in areas where, for instance, the utility is charging rural customers and the tribe different rates. So it could be the same exact distance from the transformer or the substation, but the tribe is for some reason getting a higher rate charged. Um, we will call out the utility on that. We will bring in the big guns. We will hold them to account and make sure that the utility is providing the most beneficial rates and designing new programs to get the highest returns for tribal projects. We help with fundraising and finance structuring, those creative types of financing like recoverable grants or forgivable loans to insulate against risk and help to make sure that the community can own the project. And we also can help with management of RFPs and contracts. And then implementation, operations, and maintenance is hugely important. We have seen in our experience that sometimes grant-funded projects don't allow enough budget for operations and maintenance. So we want to make sure that for every project that we do, there's an equipment reserve. If equipment fails, which it will over 25 years, that there's money to repair inverters. And with the operations and maintenance, or O&M and industry parlance, that local folks are trained. We could have people from your tribe go to RCR to Red Cloud and train up and make sure that those long-term operations and maintenance jobs are being provided to community members. We also, as a side note, have access to US made panels and batteries. So the deadline that's coming up specifically for the ITC is on panels and wind. For batteries, we're going to have longer. For geothermal and heat pumps, we're going to have longer. But these solar panels that are meeting the prohibited foreign entity requirements are going to get more and more expensive and more scarce as these deadlines approach. So it's a good time to lock in the equipment for the project so that it doesn't get delayed or we don't get stuck in the lurch on the project. So if folks have projects that are already underway that are looking for US made equipment, we do have a lot of partners in that department. And thinking beyond electricity, electricity is an enabler for what you want to achieve. And we are very committed to providing electricity for critical goods and services. So building renewable energy projects, especially for your critical goods and services, helps you to continue to support and create support for the community in all aspects. The money that comes back from electricity savings can be reinvested. The money that households or tribal buildings save can get directly reinvested. So from every sector, from housing to healthcare to schools, renewable energy can create resounding benefits. So let's work together. Let's get these ITC credits for your projects before the opportunity closes. The portal actually opened yesterday for the pre-filings, like the low-income communities tax credit. So the clock is definitely ticking. We're going to be on a sprint to get through as many projects as we can before the July 4th deadline. And it's really about a longer term legacy. You know, as John was saying, the sun shines on all of us, and this legacy of energy independence and energy sovereignty creates infrastructure that can help support the community for decades and creates a cleaner world and a relationship with the elements that can be appreciated for generations to come. So with that, we are excited to work together with all of you. And I'm going to take a peek at the chat because the next person that we had up was from the Alliance, but we got a message from Todd yesterday that he might not be able to attend. So if need be, we can skip this section. And our next section is resource sharing. So at this point, anyone who has resources that you'd like to share, anyone including the participants and attendees, if you have resources that you'd like to share with each other, we can put them in the chat. And I'll share my direct email. I would love to talk with anyone who's interested and be a resource to you. I know Lawyers for Good Government had some resources that you wanted to share in terms of links. John, feel free to pop anything you'd like to share into the chat, and I will activate a thread with everyone here in the chat. Here's my email. If you're a phone person, I'll give you my phone number as well.
There are a few questions in the chat.
Great. Yeah, while we're doing the resource share, we can also pop over to the questions. Did you want to elaborate any more on the difference between BABA and domestic content? There's a question around what the difference between the two is.
I don't have anything prepared immediately for the to directly back the two up against each other. But we do have some information on the PFE, and we have some webinars available on that I think are recorded. Rose, I don't know if those have fully been, the recordings have been released or not yet, but those are forthcoming, and we will have, I think, a third PFE webinar coming that the date is currently TBD. So some of those might need to dig in a little bit more deeply and more lengthy than we have time for right now. But I did link in that answer the document, the general guidance brief on what the domestic content requirements are for this. So there is that information available, as well as the general links available at the end of our slide presentation.
Great, thanks. I'm seeing another question here. The term community and even project sometimes doesn't apply to plug-in power. So the request is speaking to how plug-in power could be integrated into solutions for communities and projects.
Can you clarify what you mean by plug-in power?
Was that a question from you, John? I see there's a couple of Johns on the chat.
Well, I don't know how that is. I see myself in multiple places. That wasn't me. I don't know how.
Am I allowed to speak?
Sure.
Sorry, Erica Ginsburg with Gizmo Power. Yeah, that was actually my question. I have no idea how it came up as if it were John's. Just as it says. So if he's unfamiliar with plug-in power, the idea of generating electricity behind the meter by means of a plug, both whether 110, 220, plug-in power is going to be or is already sort of the next generation of behind the meter generation. So yeah, if you're unfamiliar with it, then that would be a hard question to answer. If you are familiar with it, I'd love for somebody to comment on it. Thank you. Yeah, if nobody's familiar with plug-in solar, then I guess it's a moot question.
If you're talking about something like balcony solar, whereas,
Yes,
okay,
that's fine.
so yeah,
Balcony solar is one portion of plug-in solar.
yeah. The question is really not how the project attaches to the place that it serves, at least for the elective pay credits and the investment tax credit. The question there is just, you know, is it, in the case of elective pay and the ITC, is it a non-greenhouse gas emitting method of generating electrical power? In which case, solar, regardless of whether it's plug-in, balcony solar, or other methods, is going to qualify simply because that's a non-GHG emitting generation technology. So that's really what it looks like. I do know that in the past, the common issues for that are just that it's such a small scale that it can be difficult to justify all of the tracking that's required for some of the ITC pieces. And sometimes the juice is not necessarily always worth the squeeze. But if you're dealing with plug-in power, that should not differ materially from other types. Really, the only difference in practice between something that's 100% behind the meter versus something that is flowing energy back into the grid is that placement and service state, as opposed to being a permission to operate from the utility company, which is what we typically see for things that feed into the electrical grid, would be something like an engineer's report saying, I've inspected this system and it is ready to be switched on and used. Basically, you can hit the on switch and it's not going to electrocute anybody, kind of certification. And that's what beginning of, or what placement service typically looks like in those behind the meter situations.
Well, that's somewhat helpful. I think there's more to be discussed there because obviously there's different configurations that
Mhm.
could happen, and it's exciting to think that those conversations could be had. Communities are made up of individuals, and individuals coming together can generate power for a battery and VPPs, etc. So I appreciate that response. Thank you.
I have a question around qualifying for ITC if you have other grants. So we had talked a little bit about restricted funding versus unrestricted funding. So if an organization or a tribe gets unrestricted funding generally and then reinvests that in renewables, as I understand it, that wouldn't count against what they could claim ITC on. However, yeah, I'd love to get a little bit more into the nuances in terms of if there's a grant that was for, let's say, some plug-in solar and some training, but then we wanted to claim ITC for the project. How would we go about doing that? Is it possible? Yeah, would love to understand a little bit more nuance around that.
Yeah, so kind of what that comes down to really is whether they're considered restricted funds for the purposes of the Inflation Reduction Act credits for the ITC. Um, and that is, I know a lot of entities are used to dealing with restricted funds as meaning anything that kind of has a string attached to it. And that's a broader definition than what the ITC credit uses. In the case of the ITC, funds are considered restricted if they are specifically for the purchase of credit eligible property. So, for example, if an entity received funds for the purchase of solar panels, if those funds were earmarked for that and were not allowed to be used for other items, that would be considered restricted funds. Whereas if the grant simply said for clean energy projects or for resilience projects, things like that, those would generally not be considered restricted grants because it would be possible to use that money within the terms of the grant agreement to pay for things that are not credit eligible.
Hmm.
So it's really that whether that tie-in is specifically to credit eligible property. And it does, to be clear on that, it does not preclude the claiming of the credit, which is a good thing. And I hope that my discussion of that has not given that impression to anybody. Really, what it does is it says that you can't, the amount of the credit combined with the amount of the grant can't exceed 100% of the cost of the eligible equipment. So if somebody says, this grant is to be used strictly for solar panels, and the grant covers 60% of the cost of those panels, you can still get a 30% or even a 40% ITC, assuming that the bonus credits are, or the bonus amounts are complied with, and still get that 30 to 40% there. Uh, Now, if you got a restricted grant that said this will pay specifically for solar panels and it covered 80% of the cost of the system, you would only be able to recover 20% with the elective pay credits because that then the full 30% of the credits would put you 10% over the cost of the system there combined with the grant. So that's really how it works. It doesn't actually change the basis when calculating the credit. We've had some entities think that where they're like, oh, we've had 70% of the cost, so we can only get 30% of that remaining 30% in elective pay credits. And that's not true. You'd still be able to get 30% of the total cost from elective pay credits. It's only reduced after that calculation, not before. And we've got, Rose has added some guidance on that in terms of the an actual paper on that because it's much easier to see on paper and sit down and read through rather than trying to digest it from a disembodied voice on a webinar. So hopefully that will be helpful. And again, that's available through the resource links.
Thank you. And if folks have more questions, please pop them into the Q&A. And we are going to do one final poll before we close out today. At this point, what would you say is your solar readiness level for engaging with the ITC? So, yeah, we'd love to hear from folks. If you have a project that you're already planning on, if you're in the idea phase, if you have some projects that you've been thinking about, or if you'd like to get some support with developing a project or brainstorming a project right now. And Elijah will pop that up into the poll window. Great. And as folks are filling that out, we are excited to work with all of you on projects wherever you are in the waterway, in the funnel in terms of developing your projects. And we are really here to turbocharge efforts to meet this deadline. We're very grateful for having everybody here today. Thank you so much for the speakers. Thank you for the participants. Thank you to the sun. And let's get some of these tax credits back to the communities. Thank you, John, for that reply to Diana's question. Sorry, I dropped that one. Yeah, the students do not receive a stipend during the training, but as I understand it, the tuition is free for the training.
Question, lodging, room and board, all the training materials, everything like that. So, but just where able to raise enough funding to pay people as well to come to the training. So, if we had more funding, yeah, sure. But it's all contingent on that. Thank you for the question. It was really great.
Thank you, everyone, so much. We'll send out a recording. Please spread the word with other folks, and we are here to help. So definitely reach out. Enjoy the rest of your day. Hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you.
I know.
Mach's gut.